Hi guys, so let's talk a little bit about history today. For me, it's important in my channel to talk about history from time to time. History of different elements of beauty and aesthetic. I do think that knowing the basics is very therapeutic to the mind. To the mind that has been brainwashed about beauty for so many years. So as far as my last video was about if bob haircut fits you, today we're gonna talk about the basics of the bob. I'm not gonna go very deep into that subject. We'll just see several of the most important steps in the history. So when is the first time, as we know, on the planet Earth, people started bob haircut? Basically, it happened in Egypt. Ancient Egyptian drawings, images, we can kind of see that these people loved wearing that very blunt cuts. I know that they were wearing wigs. They had that kind of dreadlocks that have very straight cuts. That what we can see from the images and from the pictures. They often had that very straight fringe. The next important step in history was in mid-centuries, where men were wearing that haircut. But at first, in the majority of cases, it was poor men who wore that haircut. Another interesting person in history is Jeanne d'Arc. She lived 600 years ago. She was a heroine of France. She was the one who was wearing that haircut. There weren't many images of her left, but some people mentioned her in their text, in their books. They did describe her as being petite, as having black hair, short hair. Her hair was chopped off. At that time, men were at war, women was sitting home, women had babies. But here and there we can hear about those brave women in the history that dared to try on that image of a man. It was so much against that social structure at that time. The majority of women had long hair. So she kind of tried on that man's role on herself. So people were rejecting that a lot. But we do remember that image of her. Then we have 1890. French actress Polaire. She cut her hair short and people started calling her the ugliest woman in the world. It was again so much against all the rules. Women at that time supposed to have long hair and that's it. And she dared to do that, and she was very petite. She was 5'3" and she had very thin waist. Her waist was not more than 16 inches. The massive cutting of women's hair started approximately at the First World War because men were at war and women were working. It was impossible for them to take care of their long hair. Their life completely changed. It was not practical anymore. In 1909, famous Polish hairdresser Antoni Cierplikowski. So he was the one who was inspired by Jeanne d'Arc, and he started cutting his clients' hair shorter. Among his clients was Coco Chanel, Queen Marie of Romania, Sarah Bernard, French actress, Greta Garbo, Brigitte Bardot, US First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. So this guy really made it happen around that time. And as you can notice, yes, that is the beginning of 20th century. This is when it became fashionable, it became beautiful, it became eye-pleasing. And then we have 1922. Howard Carter opened Tutankhamun tomb in Egypt. Never before in the history they could find that. It was very historical moment for the whole world. It was a huge achievement. People were so inspired by Egypt. It became such a trendy thing. They started calling those times Egyptomania. When women started cutting their hair short like that, with bangs like that, it was very beautiful and trendy. They actually started dressing like that, inspired by Egyptian lines, by Egyptian patterns, because Egyptian patterns, it was all very square. They didn't have those ornate lines, very complicated and rounded lines. They have very straight lines, very geometric, and also straight bob with straight fringe. It's also a pretty geometric thing. Pyramid, very geometric building. See how different that is from middle century buildings, for example. Straight lines and very simple lines here. So when did they start calling that bob? In the 20s, yeah, 1920s, because the silent movies were right at that time when bob became very trendy. This is when we have first Hollywood stars. And Hollywood stars, of course, they influenced a lot on people all over the world, on people who could watch those movies. So for them, that was something incredibly chic and beautiful, and everybody had to have that in order to be fashionable and beautiful. Of course, not everyone. Some was very old-fashioned and they hated that idea. And for many women all over the world, it became such a trendy thing and it became very beautiful and eye-pleasing. So yeah, they started calling that bob from the verb to bob, cutting off short. Many models, many dancers started wearing that haircut. Remember those small round hats? They were very popular at that time. They were so trendy, and women actually, they cut their hair for the hats to make it look good with the hat. It wasn't beautiful at that time if a woman had long hair. It actually was impossible to wear that small hats, and hats became smaller and smaller and smaller. So they had to have very flat and very short hair. Some women didn't like that idea to cut their long hair short. They cut it only at the front, and then on the back they had that long hair. They were braiding it, they were making bun at the back so nobody would see that. So the front they would have that regular bob. So in the 20s it was so popular, so they had different types of bobs. I will show you just several ones and what the names of them were. First one was brush back. Basically, yeah, they were brushing them back. A second one was Charleston. Maybe the dancers were wearing that when they were dancing Charleston in different clubs. Then we have Dutch bob. I think the name was given a little bit later, but first one who started that probably was Mary Thurman. She was very famous at that time. At the beginning she was curling her bob all the time, but then she and her friends, they went to swim. Her hair got very wet. It became very flat. It was lying on her head like that, extremely straight. They were shining because they were wet, and then her friends were like, why don't you wear it like that? It's so cool, it looks beautiful. And when she came home, she looked at that very wet, very flat bob, and she decided to make it work for herself. She chopped her straight bangs herself, and she made her hair that sleek since then, and this has became her signature look. And so many women after that really wanted to look like that, and it became very trendy and fashionable. Many women who before were curling their bobs like crazy stopped doing that. Later there was Dutch actress. Her name was Truus van Alten. She had that bob, so I think that probably they started calling that after her, Dutch bob, but I'm not sure. Number 4, very popular bob, Eton crop. There's an Eton college in the UK, and boys in that college, they were wearing that very short haircut, so women started wearing that haircut and called it Eton crop. I don't know why they put it in a bob, because it's more like a pixie, but I think pixie haircut, it appeared a little bit later, so I think that was part of the bob situation. Wind blown. So you see, they went for more romantic look. There were women who had curly hair by nature, so they didn't want to straighten it or anything like that, just to have those curls, so they would look like they're flowing with the wind. That's more like romantic, more feminine look. They had frizz bob, basically just curly bob. Now we have kiss curl. That little thing is called kiss curl, or sometimes they called it spit curl. They used sometimes saliva for that. Make it happen. Sometimes they used hair lotion or soap to keep it as it plays. Several decades later, it became a signature look to a singer, Bill Haley. With that spit curl, he wanted to distract people's attention from one of his eyes, which was blind. But it was later. Then they had orchid bob. Because of those things, normally it was in the middle of the cheek, and they made that curl to the cheek. They even stick it to the cheek. And I think this is why it was called orchid bob. But that one had many other names as well. Then they had shingle bob. Actually, that was like any other bob, but the difference was that at the back they cut it so short so you could see the hairline. So they trimmed the hairline slightly with a razor, and then above that hair started. Poodle bob. You probably know why. Then it was Egyptian bob. Egypt inspired, of course. That subject was so fresh. Everybody was talking about this. So many people were fascinated by that new knowledge. So women cut their hair like that, and very often with that small fringe. Then they had Moana bob. So as I heard, it was also inspired by Egyptian culture. I don't know who was Moana. Maybe it was a name of Egyptian woman, so they called it Moana bob. If we talk about 30s and 40s, bob started being a little bit more feminine. They pinned their hair on top sometimes. Remember, there was pin-up girls, Second World War. Women still didn't want to go back to their long hair because it was not practical, and it was still pretty fashionable from the 20s to have that short hair. Yes, it got longer from time to time. Women were curling their hair. Those Hollywood stars that started having those super white bleached blonde hair that looked amazing with those beautiful curls. You could see every curl on the screen. It looked very beautiful. Women started to style it curl to curl, so it would look very glamorous. And of course, in the 50s, Marilyn Monroe. In the 50s, we have longer hair as well, and bob as well. In several movies, Marilyn Monroe, she had more straight bob, but it still was very curled. You can see how ornate it looks. You can't see as many of those Egyptian lines anymore. Yeah, everything became softer and rounder. In the end of the 50s, we have another legendary hairdresser, Vidal Sassoon. He invented the techniques that so many modern hairstylists use. He invented that haircut when they put first layer of hair, they cut it. They put second layer of hair, and he cut it right there with very straight line. It was very, very clean work. He started doing all those very geometric and very, very blunt bobs. I remember in the 90s when I was walking around town, they had salons here and there, and everywhere I saw those pictures with women looking approximate like that. You could hardly meet that kind of woman on the street at that time, to be honest. It was kind of to show how interesting, how shocking different that looks, how perfect that looks, as if it's plastic, as if it's not a real hair. So technically, super clean job was done. You couldn't find any hair that was sticking out, even with a microscope. He wanted to invent something that women would not have to struggle with when they just wash their hair. Let it dry naturally and just go, without spending too much time for styling that. Because before, again, in the 40s, in the 50s, they kind of had to curl them every day. They were waking up a couple of hours earlier. They were pinning their hair curl by curl just to make it look very, very ornate. And this is how we gradually go to the 60s, when again we started having that geometry. And that geometry was more influenced by the space. And this is when they started having those discoveries in the field of space, stars, planets, moon. People started thinking about, is there a life on those planets? What kind of creatures live there? And this is when they started having those shiny materials. All that was about space, and we can see those bobs very often with very clean cut, very clean and blunt lines, very geometric cuts. And again, if they did those curls, it was very popular curls outwards. Everything still had a very certain shape, especially remember when they did huge volume on top, so the outline was so precise, so clean, so you could see that from the distance. And even now you can't make a mistake. If you see that haircut, you say, yeah, that definitely 60s. Also, the plus of that very geometric haircut was that it looked very groomed. It looked very clean. It gave a woman very clean and groomed look, basically from morning till night, from going out of the shower to going back to the shower. In the 60s, they also had bangs, again, if we talk about geometry. Then we have that very interesting haircut that was very popular, especially in the 70s, because of the French singer Mireille Mathieu. She had a cut that some people call that cut bowl cut, and some people call that mushroom cut. So she said she had to go to her hairdresser every 6 weeks to trim that and to cut her bangs even sooner. They didn't find her signature haircut right away. Before, she was wearing different types of bob and different types of hair. It's just once that happened that they tried to do that cut and they were like, yes, she's gonna wear that. She was very popular at that time. So we can see in the 70s how women tried that haircut as well, that mushroom haircut. Along actually with hippie, with long hair, natural hair started coming back at that period of time. People started growing their hair, letting them go. We still had straight bobs as well, and so it's like that. In the 80s, yeah, they were wearing mullets a lot because it was influenced by rock singers, but at the same time they had bobs, and when they had bobs, they normally were layered by the face or all over the head, because at the 80s we started having those hand blow dryers, and before it was huge drying machines in the salons. And so in the 80s, when women were able to buy that blow dryer, you could kind of dry your hair and curl at the same time. Women started actually doing their hairstyle at home. Of course, when you use that fan, you're basically learning how to do that volume. It was very beautiful. So they started asking for bob, but layered bob, so they would be able to achieve more volume with that blow dryer. So this is what we have. Slightly curly and very puffy everywhere. Even young girls in the 80s, they looked a little bit like aunties, older than their age. It looks very womanly. Sometimes it was a little bit awkward to see that little girl with that big and rounded hair. We could see like through the 90s and 2000s, as these women got older, they still liked that hairstyle, and actually there were many hairstyle schools that were based on that knowledge, and many of them who did make steps further on technology. You know, there are some salons, they still work with old school technology. So if I put my mom in there, they're gonna blow dry her hair like that in the 80s. She doesn't look good like that. She's tiny, she's very slim, she's slightly straight. She looks like a boy. And her being like a boy with that super mama hairstyle, she looks older with that. And sometimes when I put her to some salons, I always watch what kind of techniques they use and how they style their clients' hair after that. I'm not sure about your countries, guys, but here in Russia we still have those old school techniques, like 80s techniques on how to do the hair. In the 90s, many lengths of hair are popular, from very long to pixie. It was not more about the length of the hair, but if we talk about bobs or mid-length, they were thinning the ends. It was layered. And And why was that? Because they invented slicing, point cut, all those techniques, how to thin the ends with scissors. Pointing meaning cutting vertically, kind of not to make this line super thick, kind of make it slightly transparent. I remember that was so fashionable, and I remember in the end of the 90s, I went to a salon to make a haircut for myself. I was a teenager then, and I asked her basically to cut my hair shorter, like bob, but I didn't know what exactly suited me at that time, and she cut it blunt short like that. I looked in the mirror of me having that blunt cut, actually very close to what I have now, and feeling like that looks so stupid. I look so old-fashioned. It's like the first and most important style don't at that time. It was so funny, and she said that we have to layer them as much as possible. And you know what technique for layering they had at the time? They stretched all your hair to the top, and they just cut it straight. So when they let it go, you had those pretty thick layers. I think it also started with Jennifer Aniston in France. Remember that haircut? She had very thick hair there on top and then underneath feathers. Remember that? I remember that feeling when she made a lot of layers on my super thin hair. I loved it so much. It was super transparent there on the bottom, but I felt like that looked very fashionable. I have same mind, I have same eyes. Now I look at the same things and they don't look eye-pleasing for me. So it's very interesting. 2000, 2010, colored bobs were most popular. Again, we have all those lengths. We can't say that the bob was more popular than other haircuts at that time. And actually it wasn't, because they started doing first hair extensions. So it was pretty trendy. They still were doing a lot of layers. So it was thinned down like that. It was super fashionable, super modern to add color by the face, like make this blue, one of them green, one of them black. It was so fashionable and so beautiful. Basically everything that you can imagine, it happened in 2000. I think it was mishmash of everything. People were just rethinking all those past centuries in terms of beauty and fashion. So I think when it all started going into that more clean direction, more minimalistic direction, is after 2010. This is where we gradually go into that cleaner look, more classic, more simple look, to more blunt cut for bob. I think somewhere around 2015, and I talked to you about that in my previous videos about bob. Many women started doing that elongated bob, A-line bob, asymmetrical A-line bob, so many trends get exaggerated sometimes to a point when it looks super crazy already. Remember, that's super elongated front and super short back. So I'm pretty happy that that trend didn't live that long. And then we go basically to that lob, blunt cut, actually balayage and coloring techniques with darker roots and lighter ends. They became very popular, and many hairstylists started playing with that, with the shape and form. They started designing highlights because many highlight techniques appeared, many new products appeared. They don't harm your hair anymore like that. So basically anyone, even woman with super black hair, she still can be bleached blonde. It didn't happen before. It happened maybe last 3 or 4 years, I can say, when it's this advanced. So they started playing with that, with shape and color. It became super trendy to have those very straight bob. And actually not everyone is aware about this, but in Pinterest, when you see all those beautiful pictures of those blunt bobs and very bright bleached and very thick ends, in many cases there are hair extensions underneath, but not in all, of course. There are loads of women with pretty thick hair, but I do know that many try some hair extensions still for their bob just to get a blunt cut, and when they curl it, that would look even more thick ends. And nowadays that looks beautiful because we go into more healthy looks. Alright, I hope that was interesting. Let me know what else we should talk about soon. If you want to support me and my channel, you can click that join button. Sometimes I do some exclusive videos for you guys, or same thing, you can subscribe on my Patreon. You can subscribe on my Instagram for just random stuff from my music and from my makeup life. You can also subscribe on my Pinterest, where I have 13 boards as an inspiration for each body type. It might help you to get a better idea about the body types in general. If you love some retro music, some classic rock, you're welcome to subscribe on my music channel as well. Alright, that's it. I will see you soon. Bye bye.